Good afternoon. Dr. C, are you able to see my screen clearly?
Yes, we
All
can
right.
hear you. We can see your screen also.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Charnisha Azubuike, and today I'll be presenting my capstone project titled A Risk Adaptive Framework for Verifying LLM-Generated Summaries in Trauma and Violence Intake Systems. See. So before I get started with the presentation, I just want to start with a question. What if an AI system documenting a survivor story leaves out that a weapon was involved and no one notices? Because in trauma and violence intake systems, documentation is not just administrative, it's actually directly influencing safety planning, referrals, and sometimes crisis or legal response decisions. So if a summary is incomplete, even if it sounds fluent, it can actually lead to like underestimating risk. So this project is actually built around that concern and not necessarily whether the LLMs can summarize, but actually whether their outputs can be trusted in high stake environments without appropriate verification. So during this presentation, I will walk through the problem, my motivation, and the framework that I developed, the evaluation results, and actually what this means for real-world implementation. And as I go through this, I'll also be highlighting key points that are not explicitly shown on these slides, but especially just how the system should actually be interpreted. All right, so this project actually follows a progression. So first, I'll be identifying the gap between trauma narratives and AI-generated summaries. And second, I'll be building a framework that introduces a verification layer after generation. And third, I'll be evaluating how well the summaries preserve safety-critical information. And finally, I'll be discussing the implications for real-world use and future research. So the key idea here is that I'm not stopping at generation. I'm extending the pipeline to actually include verification and risk assessment. So looking at the problem and motivation for my capstone project, the problem is that a large language models are increasingly being used in healthcare and public health documentation. So that actually introduced risks such as hallucinations, omissions, and even misrepresentation. So what's important and not actually stated here is that in this context, omission is often the most dangerous failure mode. And because the hallucinations can sometimes be detected, sometimes the omissions often go unnoticed as well. And in trauma narratives, what gets left out is often the most sensitive and the most dangerous or the most actionable information. What motivates this work goes beyond just the technical challenge. Professionally, I work in community violence and public health, where documentation directly informs how individuals are supported. So the intake narratives actually influence how the risk is assessed, what services are provided, and how urgently someone may actually need help. So accuracy isn't just about correctness, it's about whether someone's needs are fully being recognized. And what I observed is that the systems already struggle to capture the full complexity of people's experiences. So when we do introduce AI into those processes, there's a risk that those gaps just don't actually remain. So they need to be scaled. And what concerns me the most is not just that AI can make the mistakes, it's just that those mistakes aren't often subtle and easy to overlook, especially in trauma-informed contexts where disclosures may be incomplete, language may be nuanced, and critical details may even be fragile, to say the least. But if AI simplifies that too aggressively, it can remove the very details that signal that risk. So actually, instead of seeing how can we make AI summarize better, I shifted the question to how can we make sure that it actually produces safe enough to trust. And that is what actually led me to this framework. So looking at the data set for this study, I did use a synthetic trauma-informed scenarios with the assistance of AI rather than real patient data. So each scenario was designed to reflect real-world violence context and included predefined safety-critical elements such as threats, injuries, weapon involvement, escalation, and identity accuracy. So each scenario generated multiple summaries using a consistent prompt structure. So instead, like the ground truth is actually the original narrative plus its known safety critical elements. So if the evaluation is asking, does the generated summary preserve what was originally present, this actually makes the project closer to the output auditing than actual model training. But I use the synthetic data intentionally just because trauma narrators are highly sensitive, and this is a early stage prototype, and ethical design definitely requires minimizing harm. So this was a limitation um, because of the synthetic data, with it being more structured and less complex. And it did not exactly, capture the real world variability. So this framework is going to be externally valid once it's tested on real data. So taking a look at the system architecture, this framework does consist of 3 different layers: the intake narrative, LLM-generated summary, and the verification and risk scoring. So what's important here is that the verification layer is independent of the model. It does not rely on the model to evaluate itself, but instead it acts as a separate checkpoint before the summary is used. So rather than assuming outputs are safe, the system actually evaluates whether they meet a minimum level of integrity here. So with the methodology being continued, we're going to take a look at the verification pipeline. The verification layer detects the omissions, fabrication, contradictions, name errors, and tone issues. These are identified using rule-based methods such as pattern matching and entity comparison. And these errors are then aggregated into a risk score, which is used to classify the summaries as low, medium, or high risk. This approach is actually intentionally using the rule-based system just because it's interpretable, traceable, and it also allows us to understand like why something is being flagged. In high-stake environments, that transparency, I think, is critical. So instead of like predicting outcomes, the system is designed to actually audit the outputs. So looking at the results, the analysis included 101 AI-generated summaries across 10 scenarios. And the most important finding is that 50% of summaries omitted safety critical information, and that's 1 out of every 2 summaries. So you also have the fabrication that occurred in 39%, while the name errors in 20%, and the risk classification showed 52% low risk, 39% medium risk, and 10% high risk. The average C-score was 0.62, just indicating that there was a moderate but inconsistent preservation of critical information. So this actually shows that even when the summaries appear to be coherent, they are not reliably preserving the details that actually matter the most in that situation. So now we're going to take a look at the insights. The first chart just shows that omission was the most frequent error. And this just tells us that the primary risk is not just incorrect information, it's missing information. The second chart, it actually shows that a large portion of summaries in the medium risk category, which means that many of the summaries were not completely wrong, but still not safe enough to use without review. And lastly, the third chart, you have the C-score. The C-score measures how well the summary preserves the original narrative. So the error rate tells us like what exactly went wrong, but the C-score will actually tell us how consistent the summary is overall. So like I said, with that average of 0.62, it just indicates that it's moderate consistency, but significant variability. So that actually supports the conclusion that, these outputs are not consistently reliable. All right, taking a look at the ethics, strengths, and limitations. So this project prioritizes ethical design. No real patient data was used, which protects privacy and minimizes harm. And however, bias and misrepresentation can still occur even in the simulated settings. So looking at our strengths, it's an end-to-end framework, a real-world relevance, and an interpretable design. While the limitations was the synthetic data that lacked complexity, and the rule-based methods that miss nuance, and just this being a proof of concept, with it being a prototype. In regards to the real data should definitely be used, but obviously under the strict ethical safeguards. So because real world validation is necessary for the credibility in the future, we're going to make sure that when we are able to use real world data, that is considered. So taking a look at the recommendations and future work, this framework should be used as a safety layer, not as a replacement for actual human judgment. So human in the loop validation is essential. So in regards to my future work, it does include the real world validation, hybrid models, and privacy preserving approaches like federated learning. And this will contribute to building accountable AI systems in high stake environments. This work obviously is ongoing because of the future research and PhD direction. And just want to talk about the success stories so far with my research. This slide actually highlights how this work is already extending like beyond the classroom and being in SACS. I was selected as a MSCC Scholar, which is a nationally recognized program focusing on, advancing data science. And I was also accepted to present this work in the NIH Aim Ahead Southeast Hub Symposium this year, and as well as the Homicide Research Working Group, where I'll be participating in a roundtable discussion. What's not shown here is what the actual opportunities. Oh, I'm sorry. What's not shown here is what these opportunities actually represent. These are spaces where researchers, policymakers, and even practitioners are actively working on issues related to health equity, violence prevention, and the responsible use of AI in real-world systems. So to be able to bring this work into those spaces, this means a lot more than just being a technical project. So something that actually contributes to the conversations when we talk about real world impact. And I also feel like it signals the problem that I'm addressing with the lack of verification in AI generated documentation, with it being recognized as an important gap. And that's just where the growing interest is in solutions that prioritize safety, reliability, and accountability. So for me, this just reinforces that this work has potential beyond this capstone and serves as a foundation for continued research at the intersection of public health, data science, and just decision-making systems, including the future doctoral work. And to conclude, LLM-generated summaries should not be assumed to be safe simply because they are fluent. In trauma and violence intake systems, fluency can be misleading, and a summary can sound complete and well-structured while still failing to preserve the most critical details of a survivor's experience. And what this project shows is that it is the greatest risk is not always incorrect information, but it's missing information that can change how a situation is actually understood. So this framework just really responds to the problem by introducing a verification layer that detects integrity failures, assigns risk, and actually creates a checkpoint before summaries are used in decision making. So that just pretty much sums up my presentation. In high stakes systems, the biggest risk is not what AI gets wrong, but it's really what it leaves out when no one notices. So thank you, and I welcome any questions.
Yes, the floor is open for question from students and faculties both. We are just on time, so no worries about the limit. I was just checking, so any question or any suggestion is welcome. Yes, good thing is thank you everyone who are telling excellent, excellent, excellent. So she is joining SACS for her PhD, and hopefully she will extend this work and whatever she has found after the capstone, she will work on that and come up with a really nice solution that is actually a very challenging issues that may not be seen from the outside, but it's killing from the inside. So